The light in Harbor's End. September light. The September light in Harbor's End had a quality that made everything look like it was painted in watercolors. Frank Morrison stood at his kitchen window, watching the morning sun filter through the maple tree that had been there longer than his 68 years. The leaves were just beginning to turn, hints of gold creeping in at the edges like age spots on the back of his hands. He'd been watching that tree through 4 seasons for the past 3 years, ever since he'd moved to the little coastal town in Maine after retiring from teaching high school history in Ohio. The tree was reliable, predictable. Unlike the flutter in his chest whenever he saw Margaret Sullivan walking her golden retriever past his front gate. Frank poured himself a second cup of coffee and settled into his reading chair by the front window. It was Thursday, which meant Margaret would be coming by around 9:30 on her way back from the harbor. He'd learned her schedule without meaning to. The way you learn the pattern of rain on your roof, or the sound of your neighbor's car starting in the morning. The book in his lap, a biography of Teddy Roosevelt he'd been meaning to finish for months, lay forgotten as he watched the street. Harbor's End was the kind of place where you could still do that, watch the street and wave at neighbors, where the mail carrier knew your name and the pharmacist asked about your arthritis. At exactly 9:28, Buster came around the corner first, his golden coat catching the light like spun wheat. Behind him, moving with the easy stride of someone who'd walked this route 1,000 times, came Margaret. Frank's breath caught the way it always did. She was wearing her blue windbreaker, the one that made her silver hair look like moonlight, and those sensible walking shoes that somehow made her look both practical and graceful. She'd moved to Harbor's End 6 months after Frank from Portland, where she'd been a librarian for 35 years. He'd learned this at the welcome committee meeting at the community center, where they'd sat at the same table and shared a plate of Ruth Henderson's famous oatmeal cookies. That was 2.5 years ago, and Frank had been working up the courage to ask her for coffee ever since. As Margaret approached his gate, Buster suddenly veered toward Frank's front yard, nose to the ground, following some invisible trail. Margaret followed, her face creased with the gentle exasperation of a dog owner who'd lost this battle many times before. "Buster, come on," she called, but there was laughter in her voice. "We've been over this. That's not your yard." Frank was on his feet before he'd made the conscious decision to move. He opened his front door and stepped onto the porch, trying to look casual, as if he always came outside at 9:30 on Thursday mornings. "He's welcome to explore," Frank called out. "I don't mind." Margaret looked up, shading her eyes against the sun. When she smiled, Frank felt something loosen in his chest that he'd been carrying tight for months. "Oh, Frank, I'm sorry. He's convinced there's a rabbit warren under your oak tree." "He might be right," Frank said, walking down his front steps. "I've seen a few cottontails around." He reached Margaret's side just as Buster emerged from behind the tree, tail wagging, apparently satisfied with his investigation. "How are you settling in?" "Still unpacking." Margaret laughed, a sound like water over stones. "After 2 years? I should hope not, though I did finally hang the last picture last week. It was my grandmother's wedding portrait. I could never decide where it belonged." "Where did you end up putting it?" "The hallway. She can watch over everyone who comes and goes." Margaret bent to clip Buster's leash back on. She would have liked that, I think. She was quite the hostess in her day. Frank found himself wanting to ask about her grandmother, about the wedding portrait, about what other pictures lined Margaret's hallways. Instead, he said, "Well, I should let you get on with your walk. Buster probably has more important business to attend to." "Oh yes," Margaret said, her eyes twinkling. "The ducks at the harbor won't count themselves." After they'd gone, Frank remained in his front yard longer than necessary, pulling a few weeds from around his mailbox, straightening the small American flag that flew beside his front door. The morning air carried the salt smell of the ocean and the faint scent of wood smoke from someone's early fire. He'd moved to Harbor's End for the quiet, for the chance to finally read all those books he'd assigned to students but never had time to savor himself, for the simple pleasure of watching seasons change without the pressure of lesson plans and parent conferences. He'd found all of that and more. What he hadn't expected was to find himself at 68, feeling like a teenager with his first crush. Back in his kitchen, Frank pulled out his phone and scrolled to Margaret's contact information. He'd gotten her number from the community center directory, had even typed out messages a dozen times, but had never quite managed to hit send. What would he say? Would she think it strange, a man his age asking her out like they were kids at a sock hop? He set the phone down and picked up his coffee cup, which had gone cold while he'd been outside. As he poured a fresh cup, he caught sight of his reflection in the kitchen window. Gray hair that had once been dark brown, wire-rimmed glasses that made him look more scholarly than he felt, lines around his eyes that came from 40 years of squinting at teenagers in the back row who thought he couldn't see them passing notes. He'd been married once to Linda for 28 years. They divorced amicably when their daughter Sarah was in college, both admitting that they'd grown into different people who wanted different things from whatever years they had left. Linda had remarried a cardiologist and moved to Florida. They exchanged Christmas cards and birthday wishes, and he was genuinely happy for her. But that had been 10 years ago, and in all that time, Frank had never felt the particular flutter of possibility that came with Margaret's smile, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the careful way she chose her words as if language mattered. The phone rang, startling him out of his reverie. Sarah's name flashed on the screen. "Hi, sweetheart," Frank answered. "Dad, you sound different. What's wrong?" Frank smiled. His daughter had inherited her mother's ability to read his moods from 3 states away. "Nothing's wrong. How are things in Chicago?" "Busy. Always busy. But don't change the subject. You sound, I don't know, distracted? Are you eating enough? Getting out of the house?" "Yes to both. I had breakfast with Harold Peterson yesterday at the diner. And I've been walking more." This was true, though he didn't mention that his walks often coincided with Margaret's schedule. "Good," Sarah said, but he could hear the concern in her voice. "I worry about you up there all alone. Maybe you should think about getting a dog. Didn't you always say you'd get a dog when you retired?" Frank looked out the window toward where Margaret and Buster had disappeared around the corner. "I've been thinking about it." "Really? That's great. What kind?" "Oh, I don't know yet. Maybe something medium-sized. Good-natured. The kind of dog that likes walks." They talked for a few more minutes about Sarah's work at the advertising agency, about her boyfriend Marcus, about plans for Thanksgiving. After they hung up, Frank found himself thinking about what she'd said about getting a dog. It wasn't a bad idea, actually. A dog would give him a reason to be outside more, to strike up conversations with other dog owners. Dog owners like Margaret. Frank shook his head at himself. At his age, he should be beyond such transparent scheming. But as he settled back into his reading chair with his biography of Roosevelt, he found himself thinking not about the Rough Riders or trust busting, but about golden retrievers and the best places in Harbor's End to walk them. Outside, the September light continued to paint everything in gentle colors, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of the harbor bell ringing the hour. Chapter 2: The Welcome Committee. The Harbor's End Community Center smelled like coffee and lemon oil, with an undertone of the sea that seemed to permeate every building within 5 miles of the water. Frank arrived 15 minutes early for the Welcome Committee meeting, partly out of habit. 40 years of teaching had made punctuality a religion, and partly because he knew Margaret would be there. She was already seated at the round table near the windows, sorting through a stack of brochures about local businesses and services. The afternoon light caught the silver in her hair and made her reading glasses gleam. She looked up when he entered and smiled. "Frank, right on time. Though I suppose that shouldn't surprise me. Teachers are always punctual." Reformed teacher, Frank corrected, settling into the chair across from her. These days I don't even own an alarm clock. Living dangerously, Margaret said with mock seriousness. What if you oversleep and miss something exciting? In Harbor's End? I think I'm safe. Margaret laughed. You'd be surprised. Last week Mrs. Henley's cat got stuck in the Weatherby's chimney. It was the most excitement we've had since the 4th of July fireworks. Other committee members began filtering in: Ruth Henderson with her ever-present tin of baked goods, Harold Peterson from the hardware store, Dr. Emily Chun, who'd moved to Harbor's End to semi-retire from her cardiology practice in Boston, and Tom Bradley, the former Coast Guard officer who now ran the lighthouse tours. All right, everyone. Ruth called the meeting to order with the authority of someone who'd been organizing community events since the Eisenhower administration. We have 3 new residents to welcome this month. Frank only half listened as Ruth went through the agenda. Instead, he found himself watching Margaret take notes in a small blue notebook, her handwriting neat and precise. She had capable hands, he noticed, with short, practical nails and a simple silver wedding band that she still wore on her right hand. He wondered about that, about the story behind it, about the man who'd given it to her. Frank. Ruth's voice broke through his wandering thoughts. You're in charge of the Henderson place on Maple Street, right? Frank blinked, realizing he'd completely missed the assignment of welcome duties. I'm sorry, which house? Margaret leaned toward him, close enough that he caught a hint of her perfume, something light and floral. The new family from Boston, she said quietly. The Weatherby's old house. Right, Frank said, hoping he didn't sound as distracted as he felt. The Henderson place. Of course. After the meeting, Frank lingered as the others filed out, making a show of organizing his papers while Margaret finished updating the resident directory. When they were the only ones left, she looked up with a question in her eyes. Everything all right? You seemed a million miles away during the meeting. Frank felt heat creep up his neck. Just thinking about the new residents, wondering how they'll adjust to small-town life after Boston. It can be quite a change, Margaret agreed. When I moved here from Portland, I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. It seemed too peaceful, too perfect. I was convinced there had to be some dark secret lurking beneath the surface. And? Did you find one? Only that Harold Peterson waters his lawn at 5:30 in the morning and thinks nobody notices, and that Dr. Chun has been feeding the stray cats behind the community center even though there's a town ordinance against it. Frank smiled. Scandalous. I know. I may never recover from the shock. Margaret closed her notebook and gathered her things. Would you like to walk out together? I need to stop by the library before it closes. They stepped out into the crisp October afternoon. The air carried the smell of burning leaves and the promise of the winter to come. Frank's car was parked next to Margaret's in the small lot behind the community center. Nice car, he said, nodding toward her silver Honda Civic. Reliable. Very, though not particularly exciting. She unlocked her door, then paused. Frank, can I ask you something? His heart did a small skip. Of course. You've seemed, I don't know, distracted lately. At the meetings around town. Is everything all right? I don't mean to pry, but as a librarian, I've developed a talent for noticing when people have something on their minds. Frank looked into her concerned brown eyes and felt the words gather in his throat. Here was his opening, his chance to say what he'd been thinking for months. Instead, he heard himself saying, just adjusting to retirement, I think. Some days I'm not sure what to do with all the time. It wasn't entirely untrue, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Margaret nodded sympathetically. I felt the same way when I first retired. 35 years of structure, of people depending on you, and then suddenly, nothing. It's harder than people expect. How did you get through it? Honestly, I got Buster. She smiled. It sounds silly, but having something that needed me, even just for walks and meals, made all the difference. Gave me a reason to get up in the morning. Sarah, my daughter, suggested I get a dog. She's a smart woman. What's holding you back? Frank considered this. What was holding him back? The responsibility? The commitment? Or was it something else, some part of him that was afraid of needing something or someone again? I guess I'm not sure I'm ready, he said finally. Margaret studied his face for a moment, and Frank had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see more than he intended to show. Well, she said, when you are ready, let me know. I know all the best places to walk dogs in Harbor's End. After she'd driven away, Frank sat in his car for several minutes, engine running, heat blasting against the October chill. He'd had the perfect opportunity to ask her for coffee or dinner, or even just to extend one of their brief conversations. Instead, he talked about dogs and retirement adjustment like they were discussing the weather. At this rate, he'd be 90 before he worked up the courage to tell her how he felt. That evening, Frank made himself a simple dinner of grilled cheese and tomato soup, then settled in his living room with a glass of wine and the Roosevelt biography. But instead of reading, he found himself thinking about Margaret's question. What was holding him back? Fear, he supposed. Fear of rejection, of making things awkward in their small community, of discovering that the warmth in her eyes was just general kindness and not the particular interest he hoped it might be. But there was something else, too. A deeper fear that he wasn't ready to examine too closely. The fear that at 68, maybe it was too late to start over, to open his heart to the possibility of love again. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending leaves skittering across the lawn. Frank pulled a throw blanket around his shoulders and listened to the sounds of the house settling around him. It was a good house, solid and well-built, with a view of the harbor from the upstairs bedroom and a fireplace that drew properly. But tonight it felt particularly quiet. Chapter 3: The Lighthouse. November came to Harbor's End with a fury of wind and rain that stripped the last leaves from the trees and sent the harbor waters churning gray and white. Frank spent the first week of the month reading by his fireplace, venturing out only for necessities and the occasional meal at Murphy's Diner. He was beginning to think he'd spend the entire winter hibernating when Tom Bradley called. "Frank, I need a favor." Tom's voice crackled through the phone, competing with the sound of rain against Frank's windows. "I've got a group coming up from Boston this weekend for a lighthouse tour, and my usual helper is down with the flu. Any chance you'd be interested in lending a hand?" Frank looked out at the storm, then at the book in his lap that he'd been struggling to focus on for the past hour. "What would I need to do?" "Nothing too strenuous. Help with the equipment, maybe share a little local history. I know you've got a teacher's touch for making things interesting." "I'm not sure how much I know about lighthouse history." "More than you think. I bet. Besides, Margaret Sullivan's going to be there as the official historian. She's been researching the lighthouse for some book project she's working on." Frank's pulse quickened. "Margaret's going to be there?" "Yep. Turns out she's quite the expert on local maritime history. Who knew librarians could be so fascinating?" Frank found himself agreeing before he'd fully thought it through. Saturday afternoon found him standing at the base of Harbor's End Light, pulling his jacket tighter against the wind that seemed to come from all directions at once. The lighthouse stood on a rocky point about a mile from town, a sturdy white tower that had been guiding ships safely to harbor for over 150 years. Frank had driven past it countless times but had never actually climbed to the top. Tom's van pulled up just as the first of the tour group arrived. A dozen people in expensive rain gear who looked like they'd rather be indoors by a fire. Margaret's Honda followed closely behind. She stepped out of her car carrying a leather messenger bag and wearing a rain slicker that made her look ready for anything. When she spotted Frank, her face lit up with surprise. "Frank, I didn't know you were helping Tom today." "Last-minute recruitment," Frank said, walking over to help her with her bag. "Tom mentioned you're working on a book?" "Oh, nothing that grand. Just a little research project about the local lighthouses. I've always been fascinated by maritime history." She looked up at the tower, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Did you know this lighthouse has never had its light extinguished? Not once in over 150 years. I didn't know that. Even during the worst storms, even during World War II when they dimmed most coastal lights, Harbor's End Light kept burning." The keeper's logs are fascinating, full of stories about ships guided to safety, about families who lived here, about the rhythm of life dictated by tides and weather. As she spoke, Frank found himself caught up in her passion for the subject. He'd always known Margaret was intelligent, but seeing her in her element, sharing knowledge she'd clearly spent hours researching, revealed a depth of curiosity and scholarship that drew him like a magnet. Tom gathered the group at the base of the lighthouse and launched into his standard introduction about the construction and technical specifications. When he got to the historical significance, he nodded to Margaret. "Now, Margaret here knows more about the human stories behind this lighthouse than anyone in Maine," Tom said. "Margaret." Margaret stepped forward, suddenly transformed from the quiet library volunteer Frank knew into someone completely comfortable commanding a group's attention. "The first keeper of Harbor's End Light was a man named Josiah Weber," she began. "He came here in 1872 with his wife Catherine and their 3 children. They lived in the keeper's house. You can see the foundation stones over there. And for 37 years, Josiah climbed these stairs every evening to light the lamp." She led the group up the narrow spiral staircase, her voice carrying clearly in the confined space as she shared stories about storms weathered, ships saved, and the lonely beauty of lighthouse life. Frank found himself hanging on every word, not just because of the stories themselves, but because of the way Margaret told them, making the past come alive with vivid details about daily life, about children who grew up counting their days by the rhythm of foghorns and tide changes. At the top of the lighthouse, the wind was fierce enough to make conversation difficult, but the view was spectacular. Harbor's End spread out below them, the town looking like a collection of toy houses nestled against the curve of the harbor. In the distance, Frank could see his own house, a small white dot among the bare trees. Margaret moved to the railing beside him, her hair whipping in the wind. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she called over the sound of the gale. "Incredible," Frank replied, though he was looking at her profile more than the view. "I come up here sometimes when I need to think," she said. "There's something about the perspective that helps put things in order." "What kinds of things do you need to put in order?" Margaret was